All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Stuck. I'm one of the co-producers of Walk, Listen, Create. For those of you who are new to Walk, Listen, Create and Walking Writers Salons, let me just say a little bit about us and what we get up to. We're a not-for-profit social enterprise. We're registered in Belgium because we suddenly thought, gosh, we want to see if we can apply for EU funding. We run a website where we support artists, writers, performers who make work on foot or to be experienced on foot, or who write about walking, of which Alan, our guest, is one. What we try to do with our writers' salons is we try to explore just as much about our guests' approach to writing as about their approach to walking, and find out a bit more about their walking and maybe their writing. So it's a bit more of a sort of hopefully investigation, not just into the content of the book that they've written, but also into their approach to writing. Now, Alan and I will chat for about 20 minutes, then we'll open up for questions. So please be encouraged to put things in the chat. Anyway, so let me introduce Alan. Alan is the author of several books on footpaths in Cumbria, including one he's co-authored with his wife, Leslie. So welcome, Leslie. I know Leslie's listening in. Corpse Roads of Cumbria. And that won the 2019 Lakeland Book of the Year Prize. Now, Alan's a former journalist, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit when we start the questioning. He's worked in regional press, and he lives in Whitehaven in Cumbria. Alan and Leslie enjoy nothing more than walking a footpath and hearing the stories it has to tell. And his latest book, as you know, is The Postal Paths, and it looks at paths walked by rural posties delivering mail to the most remote homes and farms in Britain. And the walking routes were phased out in the 60s in favour of using a van. Well, how's that possible, Alan? How can you phase out walking to deliver the post?
I'm sure somebody reasoned that it would probably save them a few pence. Yeah, they're most of them, I think, sort of late 60s, early 70s, most were phased out. And the rural postmen were given vans. So it often meant, in a sense, a longer route because they were no longer shortcutting across fields. They were driving around in a van. But it was the end of an era, and I realize now that we sort of didn't say goodbye properly to the rural postmen and women. So I'm hoping this book will do that.
Okay, so why this topic? I mean, you've written about paths in Cumbria. I know they're called lonnings. And tell the audience what that means, but what, why this topic? You're a nutter about the postie, are you? Did you once wear the uniform yourself?
No, I never was a postman. I did deliver newspapers when I was a young lad, but not a postman. Yeah, well, as you said in your intro, Leslie and I have, love walking, and we like footpaths with a bit of a story behind them. And yeah, we worked on, when I first came to Cumbria, I discovered lonnings, as Cumbrians call them, which are a particular type of country lane. And it was the names particularly of the lonning. Most of them have a local name. So, you'll get Billy Watson's lonning or Johnny Bulldog lonning, Lover's lonning if it's favoured by lovers, or Thin and Fat lonning, Squeezy Gut lonning, Dynamite lonning, all of those. So I loved that, and I looked at those first of all, and then we moved on and stumbled across corpse roads, which are the old medieval routes for taking the dead to the church, and put that together in a book. And in fact, it was while researching a corpse road in Colbeck that I was talking to a farmer, Tony. And when Leslie and I said our goodbyes, he said, "Oh, well, take the postman's path back to the village." And that wasn't something I'd heard of before. And he explained that the rural postman used to walk between the farms delivering the mail. and he'd shortcut across the fields, and he showed me some steps in a dry stone wall which the previous farmer had to put in, because every time the postman climbed over, he damaged the wall. So these steps were to sort of negate that, really. And so I went back home, did what any good journalist does, and go onto Google and Googled Postman's Paths, and I found that there were quite a lot around Britain, normally quite short. Most of the time, most people didn't know why they were called that or where they came from, but they were usually shortcuts used by rural postmen. And I thought, I need to find out a bit more about this. So that's how it came about.
Oh no, that's brilliant. And but what was the intention always to write a book? Did you kind of think, oh, these are interesting paths? Did you think first of all, and also, were you thinking about this is a really nice research topic to do, in the winter or during COVID or whatever?
Yeah, well, I certainly had a book in mind, and my first thought was doing it as my previous books had been, just on Cumbria. But I quickly realised it would be difficult to find enough in Cumbria, really. The problem was that I didn't want to just look at the shortcuts. I wanted to look at the whole route that the postman did, because these would be anything up to 20 miles a day. And I thought, this is through beautiful countryside. It'll make, a lovely walk. So I thought I need to sort of research this, and I knew it would be difficult. So very quickly, I sort of decided this is going to probably have to be a UK wide book, really, in order to sort of get enough material together on it. But I'd worked on a number of projects on footpaths, which had all died a death. So I didn't hold out much hope for Postal Paths until January the 1st, 2020, when I put on Twitter that, right, this year I'm going to look at Postal Paths and the routes of the rural posties. And woke up the next morning to find that the number of followers I'd got had gone up from sort of 8 to 18,000. And everybody was saying, what a great idea. And others saying, is this a real job, Alan? Can I have a go? People inviting me for tea, just saying, well, look, if you're down in Sussex, pop in and have a cup of tea. Absolutely lovely. And a lot of people giving feedback and saying, oh, we've got a postman's path near us, or, my granddad was a rural postman. So that sort of kick-started it, really.
Yeah. And when did the publisher come on board? Because this was, this was an idea you had. You got a track record, so you were published before. So when did the publisher ring you up and say, "Here's 25,000"?
How did you find out? My previous books were self-published, and that was great. I enjoyed the design and process, and it's fine in Cumbria. Well, what happened was that my Twitter went berserk, and one of the people who got in touch was Matthew Weaver from The Guardian, an investigative journalist from The Guardian, worked on the Boris Johnson gate and all of that. And he was very interested in doing a story, and I couldn't make this out. I said, but this is, a niche topic, this is so niche. Why on earth is The Guardian interested? And he just said, well, it's so Guardian, it's writing letters, it's the nostalgia of the postman, it's walking, it's all of that. So you couldn't say no to him. So he kindly did an article, and that brought in some more rural postmen and their memories. But it also led to an agent and publishers getting in touch because they'd seen it in The Guardian. You know how shallow these publishers are, Andrew. They see.
I was once one of those. I was once one of those shallow ones walking in the shallow water. So yeah, I know.
I think in this modern age, they didn't want to know if I could actually write. They just saw 18,000 followers and thought, right, we might sell a couple of copies. Let's. No, they were seriously. They were as enthusiastic as me, and that was lovely because, as I said, I thought it was a niche topic. I thought Lonnings and Corpse Roads were niche, but this was probably even more niche. And so it's lovely that so many people, it just rang a chord with them.
Yeah. Now, so how much time did it take to write a book, and how much of that time was walking, and how much was researching, and how much of it was writing? Do you know what
Well,
was the sort of kind of balance of that?
I mean, it's been 5 years in the making, 2020, but of course, COVID took a year out, and that was frustrating. And you know, a lot of sort of armchair and laptop research. The big problem was, I mean, I spent more than usual perhaps on the research, because nothing had been written. I mean, normally as a journalist, I'd just copy other people's material, change it slightly, and pass it off as my own. But with this, you know, I actually had to do some work. I mean, I wanted to explore the postal routes, and I knew that the postman had a route card, and I've got one here. I'll just show you there, which is a list of all the houses and farms and cottages that they had to visit on their route. And I thought, well, I'll just go down to the archives at the Royal Mail in London, open a drawer and pick out the nicest ones, and the book will be finished by Christmas. And of course, when I got down there, they said, well, no, nobody ever kept these. You know, these were are as rare as hen's teeth, because, I mean, once the postman's walked it, you know, 100 times, why on earth would you want to keep the
Indeed,
route?
indeed, they can keep it. They know it. Yeah, yeah.
So I,
I mean, with the route cards themselves, were they based on the number of properties they were going to deliver? I mean, some of these routes they took were sort of like you talk about, some are sort of 7 miles, and God
yeah.
almighty, someone walks every day 20 miles. So what was how was it determined?
Well, there was an inspector who worked out the route, and they timed it as well. And once a year, an inspector would come round with the rural postie and say, you know, right, you've got to be at this house at 12:03. I mean, we think it's bad today, but I'm sure some posties involved will confirm that. But they were just as bad then. And I mean, I hear many funny stories of the rural postie sort of going around the day before, telling his regular customers, look, I've got the inspector coming round tomorrow, so don't invite me in for a cup of tea or a sandwich. You know, I've got to stick to a timetable. So they worked out a route, and it would change regularly. I mean, as new houses were added, or, you know, miners' cottages were made redundant, so it didn't always stay the same, but it did change. And yeah, so I had to find the routes, and it was finding any rural postman who was still alive, and there's not many, and also finding newspaper articles, you know, which described the route, or some of the route instruction cards. Some local history societies had somehow managed to keep the route cards, and but that was a tough job. So in the end, I mean, the walking, of course, took 2 or 3 years, because I was going all over the country, totally wrecked the car mileage wise, and then about a year to write it. So a disproportionate amount of time researching it, and a luxurious time walking them, and going
And
around.
and you track down some of these retired rural posties in their 80s and 90s and actually interviewed them. So
Yeah. That
I mean, you know, how much of your time was spent interviewing? You're a journalist. You interview people all the time. You know how to keep it short. So, but but you know,
Well, they were all lovely. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you take, say, the last sort of postal path was, you know, lost in about 1978 or whatever like that. And if it was walked by a 20-year-old, you know, you're now looking at somebody who is, I can't do the maths, 80 years old, whatever. So, but of course, most rural posties were of an age even then. So I found about a dozen, I think, who were alive and happy to talk to me, and delighted that somebody was taking an interest
yeah.
in what they'd done. And as I said at the start, I think we sort of said goodbye to well, we didn't say goodbye to these people properly and thank them properly for what they did. So they were all absolutely chuffed to be interviewed. Yes, I'm a journalist, so I talk to anyone, you know, and but yeah, sitting having cups of tea and talking about walking these routes and the life of a postman was was just joyous, you know.
So I mean, when you did talk to them, did any of them actually? I mean, was it all, you know, oh, these were glorious days, or did some of them actually admit that, you know, it was a shit job and their employer was bastards?
I, uh, none of them did say it was absolutely dreadful and never darkened my door again. And I think if it had been dreadful, they'd have given up straight away. You don't walk, you know, that many miles a day and not enjoy it. I mean, the one who walked Shap, Stuart, who's still alive, you know, he was typical. I said to him, what was it like, you know, when the van that they wrote to you and said, we're going to give you a van, you no longer have to walk this route? And he said, I was heartbroken, you know. He said, I absolutely loved walking the fells and doing this walk. So to be given a van was just dreadful, you know. And they were all like that. They all realized this was the best time of their lives, you know. This was not working. That's why they did it for such poor pay, I think, as well, you know, because they enjoyed it so much and were happy to do it.
And as you rightly say in the book, and I'm sure other people have thought about it too, is that they were news carriers as well as mail carriers.
Yeah,
They were sort of I don't know, a thread through a community. I mean, many of these rural farmers would only meet at the auction. You know, they
yeah, yeah.
the livestock auction, wouldn't it?
Oh, they're absolutely spot on. Yes, I mean they were. I think the problem is that we give people a job title. You know, we think the hotel doorman is just opens the door when, of course, he or she is talking to customers, telling them where to go on their days out and helping them with their luggage and doing a lot more. And it's the same with the rural posties. They were a lot more than delivering mail. They were delivering medicine, delivering newspapers, delivering news, and you know, you come across many an occasion where people were only seeing, you know, the rural postman and perhaps one other person once or twice a year. And this is like early 1960s. You know, this isn't 19th century necessarily. And there's so many lovely tales, but there's one, I mean, from Wales, where this chap's talking to his mother, and he asks her what the new rural postman is like. A new rural postman had taken over, and she says, "Well, he's dreadful. He's only any good for delivering mail." And and of course, that was the whole point. That, you know, that we the post office and most of us probably think that's what the postman does. He delivers mail, but they weren't. They were talking to people. They were, you know, helping them. They were being a friend, you know. So yeah, absolutely fantastic what they did and still do.
And of course the other thing is they not only delivered the mail but they collected mail, and something that I thought was kind of really telling was that they could be in big trouble if they collected the mail early or if they were late collecting the mail. I don't know how the inspector was, you know, who was down in the Mount Pleasant
Yeah.
postal sorting office could tell whether um,
It was a rigid rule about when they would empty the mailboxes and they would collect mail from people, and emptying mailboxes had to be done at the precise time. And if they did it too early, that's when they got into trouble, because somebody would invariably come along and deliver a letter, and it would then be a day late, and the complaints would ensue. So they would often sort of sit and wait by a post box for the last 20 minutes or whatever. But you raise an important point. I think I assumed that all routes were circular when I started, that they'd start at the post office and then come round and finish. And a lot are like that. But there were also linear ones. And so what they would do is they'd walk, you know, perhaps along the bottom of a valley, delivering the mail. They would then rest for 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes a friendly farmer would lend them a room. They would sit in a pub on occasion, but there were also postmen's huts. The post office provided them with 4 sheets of corrugated iron and a pot-bellied stove, and they could sit there for 2 or 3 hours.
did they get a bog roll as well?
Well, they had their lunch there, or bait as we call it in Cumbria. They had their lunch, but what they would do then is come back on the same route and collect mail, because they were collecting your replies. So Andrew, you would get your post first thing in the morning. You would then diligently sit there all morning writing your replies, and when the postman came back, he would blow his whistle or ring a bell or blow a horn on occasion, and to let people know he was coming back. And you could go out, you could buy a stamp off him, you could even deliver a parcel. He'd have sort of scales to hold, and you could do that. So there was all of that sort of side to it up until probably about 1960. I think that the sort of idea of coming back and collecting mail. By then, there were enough post boxes around for people to deliver.
Yeah, and also I think the other thing that I thought was really, I had never thought of it, but it was a really good point, was the idea of a letterbox in your own home.
Yes.
Yeah, and then what an impact that had on the numbers of cups of tea and sarnies the postie might have had, you know.
It hadn't occurred to me, and I devote a bit in the book to this, because I fear that the letterbox sort of was the first sort of nail in the coffin of society as we know it. Up until then, the postman had to knock on your door and hand you the mail. That meant that he could also check you were okay, have a chat, sell you a stamp or whatever. So there was that community sort of built into it there and then. And then the post office realized that if there was a sort of slot in somebody's letterbox, or the postman was allowed to push it under the door, they could save time and also, then cut the workforce. So they started encouraging people to have letterboxes inserted into their door. And that meant the postman didn't have to talk, you didn't have to talk to them. And very early on, somebody said to me, do you know the name of your postman? And I thought, gosh, that's a good, I do, by the way, it's Sean. But I asked that in audiences, and about a third say, yes, we know the name, and the others don't. And I think there's a certain sadness about that. So yeah, the letterbox sort of killed off that a lot of
And what time of what when was that? When was the first stamp and when was the first letterbox?
Well, the stamp. I mean, I start sort of 1840 with the penny black and universal cheap postage, and that was the Great Revolution, which boosted literacy. People had a reason to learn to read and write. They could write to their family and friends. It boosted trade. It was an amazing invention, the postage stamp. Round about 1850 or 60, they said, right, we're now going to deliver to every house in Britain. Previously, if you lived in a very rural area, you had to collect your post or pay extra. So then that's where the rural postman came in, about 1860. Letterboxes about 1890, 1880, 1890. Bikes 1900, the postman's hut 1900, and then the demise of the rural post in the 1960s. Although the last postal path was 89 on the Isle of Harris, in Renegedale at the Isle of Harris.
Yeah, but they also got rid of bicycles, because I understood that they introduced bicycles.
Yes.
A great story about some chap who used a bicycle to get himself back to the main post office, and used to get ticked off because he collected the mail early because
that was John down at Devil's Bridge. A lovely day, a gorgeous sunshine, chatting to this bloke with this lovely Welsh accent. He knew everybody in the valley, of course. Or as he said something in a lovely Welsh lilt. I am not a stranger to anyone in this valley. Yes, he got into trouble because he sort of took over a walking round in the holiday first of all, and he realised he could do it quicker on his bike. and he did wait. He did wait to empty the post box at 10 o'clock or whenever it should have been. But he then made the mistake of cycling back to the post office. And they said, well, you're too quick. You must have emptied the post box too early. And he told them he'd got a bike. And of course, they were horrified because they realized, he'd shown them up a bit and would get them into trouble, I think. But yeah, all sorts of revenue. Bikes, a lot of people still think postmen use bikes, but 2014 is when health and safety said, riding a bicycle laden with parcels that are top heavy is not a good idea in heavy traffic. So yeah.
Yeah, because they had a run in on golf trolleys as well. So you can tell I've been, I'm not sure you could either take it. I mean, many of the routes you couldn't have cycled anyway, could you? I mean, you'd have had to have had a mountain bike.
No, that's right. I mean, I concentrate mainly on the walking routes, but I do touch on some cycling routes. And so they're mainly in the sort of northwest and the rugged parts of Britain, Scotland and all of that, because they were the walking routes. In the soft Kent, Sussex, Hampshire places, bicycles were more common. And the other thing about the postman's bike is that it had no gears. I don't know whether the post office had just never thought of gears, but so if it was hilly, the bike was really not much use to them because, say, without gears, it was just a nightmare. So there's a number where they mix the two. They would cycle along the easy bits, then leave the bike and walk the rugged bits.
Well, I mean, the other thing though, also, I mean, we're talking about postmen, but there are loads of post women in your book as
Yes.
well, and they huge distances too. I mean,
Yes, and I mean it wasn't just tokenism. The post office employed women and men equally, really. I think from the start. I mean, there was obviously that imbalance, and women in the post office had to retire when they got married, up until 1940, about 1940.
oh, that's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. So they had to retire once they got married.
I know, and the post office in-house magazine would print a page of sort of congratulations. You're going off to be a housewife, and you're leaving the post office. But the post office were also good in employing disabled people, and particularly after World War One and all the casualties there. The post office, really played its part in giving jobs to people with disabilities. So one of the first I walked with my wife Leslie was at Bowes in Northumberland, which was a struggle for us. But the postman who used to do it all the time only had one leg, and he did it in all weathers. And even blind postmen. And I spoke to a blind journalist once, and I mentioned this, and he scoffed and he said, "Don't be silly. How can blind people deliver the post?" But of course, they were walking the same route day in, day out, and they'd be given the mail in order of delivery. And when they got there, they'd knock on the door and say, "Here's your post." And the person would say, "Oh, yes. And there's the next letters for so-and-so next door." So there were plenty of, blind postmen who served their communities very well indeed.
And back to the paths that you walked, how many of them were rights of way and had become rights of way, and how many of them were still private land and you were trespassing?
I'm glad to say I never trespass, Andrew. Good grief. I'm glad to say they're all public footpaths. I expected to come across perhaps one or two where they'd sort of lost footpath status. I think for most of the time, the postman created the paths, the shortcuts and the postman's paths by sort of mutual agreement with the landowner or farmer because he was delivering their mail. But it seems that when the first footpaths were recorded on OS maps, the fact that a postman was walking it once or twice a day made it an official footpath. But there were instances where the post office did arrange legal contracts to open up these footpaths. But no, they're all public footpaths, and I have walked them all, despite what my agent Ben thinks, because he said, "You're not actually going to walk all of these footpaths, are you, Alan?" And yes, that's the whole joy of it, you know. So yes, I've walked them all and hope to walk many more.
So you haven't got Google Earth drones going down the route first.
No, and it's strangely it's not as easy. I mean, I went to do one at Stones and in hang on, which one's that? Stafford, Shropshire, or Shropshire. Looking at my wife there, forgot get my counties mixed up. And we arrived there, and it was the hottest day of the century, and we couldn't walk it. It was just too hot. We'd arranged to meet somebody who would guide us around. And then the next time I went, it was snow and ice, and I couldn't walk it because it was snow and ice. So, you know, it sounds easy just driving somewhere, walking a footpath, but it did have its challenges. And of course, the Isle of Harris is a 9-hour journey, even from this far northern spot. So, you know, that was a killer as well.
And the thing to remember is that the postman walked those.
Yes, yes.
Post actually walked them. So
I'd come back absolutely exhausted, and I'm thinking, hang on, I've done this in reasonably good weather. I wasn't carrying a heavy mail bag, and I don't have to do it tomorrow. You know, I can have the rest of the week off. They were doing 6 days a week up until the mid 60s, and earlier on up and including Christmas Day, unless it was a Sunday. Yeah, I had it easy, but yeah, the longest I've come across was in Yorkshire, and that was 30 miles a day, which is just mind-boggling. And some of these would walk their 20 miles, and then in the evening they'd go for a leisurely walk by the river just for the fun of it, you know.
Oh, well, no, I was going to say because one of Jeff Jones was asking about that. Jeff, do you want to ask your question? You know, and unmute yourself, and anyone else who wants to add things, questions in the chat, then please do.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I've said, it's a question of whether walking was associated with work as opposed to a pleasure. And so did they welcome the vans? Were they regretful that the walks fell into disuse? You've just mentioned that they like to go walking along the riverside, etc. So yeah, I mean, harking back to the days when people had to work extremely hard in the countryside and long hours. Yeah, so
yeah, well, they missed walking, and even those who retired, told me that they missed that long walk. There's one lovely tale again from Yorkshire, and it was a rural postman who'd do his sort of 15-20 miles every day, and then he decides to take a week off and have a holiday, and he spends his holiday walking the same route that he walked every day, delivering mail. And somebody said to him, but you had a chance to have a rest or do something different. It must have been pointless and walking the same route. And he very smugly said, well, not at all, because I didn't have to carry the mail. It was the replacement postman who had to carry the mail. So he was able to just enjoy his trip round. Yeah, they very much enjoyed it. And I mean, somebody asked as well about the sort of health of postmen, and they did seem to live long and prosper on their fitness regime. It seems to have done them good, but it would be interesting to do a bit more scientific research on how healthy or unhealthy it was. I think the danger is always when you stop walking, when you do retire and you don't keep walking, that's when the body sort of hits back. But
okay, so there's someone here, Rosemary, who you're asking about Dinah Johnson and the Handwritten Letter Society. Rosemary, do you want to say something about it? Oh, you're on mute, Rosemary. You just have to unmute yourself.
Got it.
So, thanks, Alan.
Hello, Rosemary.
I've learned quite a bit already, and I'm looking forward to getting your book. I know that you write to Dinah, and I'm sure she writes to you. So I'd like to hear your take on the Handwritten Letter Appreciation Society.
Yes. Well, for those who don't know, there is a thing called the Handwritten Letter Appreciation Society, run by Dinah Johnson down in Dorset. So, of course, I had to join. A part of the joy of doing Postal Paths and what appealed to me about it was I love handwriting letters, and I go a bit further because I've always enjoyed doodling on my letters as well. So I've got some here. I sort of do painted envelopes with sort of different illustrations on. So I make it a real sort of art form. So what I did when I did my Postal Paths is that I wrote a letter every time I walked one of the paths to Dinah, describing the route and just telling her about the postman or woman who used to walk it. And she's doing a great job because we're seeing basically I think the death throes of the postal service. You know, they're cutting down, getting more and more expensive. And, you know, we need to encourage people to handwrite letters. And so she's doing a fantastic job in getting people to rediscover the joy of the handwritten letter. So
okay,
everybody, write more letters.
Yeah. And the next book, it will be handwritten, will it?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. I have done handwritten little books before. I enjoy handwriting. I mean, when I say I wrote letters when I finished the footpaths, I would write to Dinah and describe them. But I do keep copious handwritten notebooks, and I would usually start by writing out, you know, about the path and about the things on there, just because I think when you handwrite, you slow down, and that makes you think a bit more about what you're writing and how you're writing it. So yeah, watch this space, Andrew. There may yet be a handwritten Postal Paths.
Well, what I was going to ask was, I mean, of your research of the paths, I mean, do you take lots of photographs, or are you a sketcher, or are you a writer? I mean, I'm trusting as a journalist, you probably have shorthand.
I do, and I quickly discovered that it's rusty, and so I do shorthand. I can do shorthand, but when I was interviewing the rural posties, I did resort to switching a microphone on my smartphone, just because I no longer trusted my shorthand. But also, I think I was thinking these people, dare I say, getting older. And it would be nice to have a bit of an oral history of some of these. So yes, I take lots of photographs, partly to remember, you know, what I've seen. I do also sketch. I'm not an artist, but I enjoy doodling. So I usually sketch while I'm out. And again, I think that's sort of part of the thing of just stopping and slowing down and looking at the countryside around you. And you know, I describe in one part of the book, I actually say this, you know, I stop, and when you stop and sit down on a footpath, everything else slows down, and suddenly you notice the small little flowers that you'd missed, and the, you know, little creatures scurrying about on the bank, and the birds, and you miss all of that when you're walking along. So you have to sit still for 20 minutes or so before that sort of world opens up to you. But it's very rewarding when you do it.
Well, actually, I actually was offering you that was a leading question to let you say something about the fact that you do take photographs, because you told me when we did a little Zoom for recording for social media, I remember you saying your wisdom, your word of wisdom was take a look, turn around, take a photograph.
Yes,
where you've come from, because you walk back.
That's my top tip. When particularly I'm here in the Lake District, and when you go walking, is to stop every now and again, turn around 180 degrees and take a photograph, because when you come back, you'll need to know where you walked, and it never looks the same. So it saved my life a few times, as good a map reader as I am, to actually have a photograph showing the gate that you came through and the landscape. Yes.
What's very nice is that we've got Jane Sharkey, who's says that she's on Lundy. So and we don't usually get someone on the Isle of in the middle of the Bristol Channel. So there we go. She says they have their own postal service.
Good, good. I did look a bit at the lighthouses and the coastal postmen as part of all of this. They were a sort of a breed apart, really, because they were often walking along the cliff tops, to reach the lighthouse, often to a remote path. So, for example, down in Kent, the postman there was walking on shingle out to the lighthouse, and came up with the wonderful idea of strapping 2 bits of wood to his feet like skis, because this enabled him to get across the shingle a lot quicker. And there's some lovely archive footage on Pathé Films of him doing this. But there's others in, Anglesey as well, where the lighthouse is sort of, I think it's about 250 steps down and up to reach the lighthouse. So the postmen on the edge of the land were doing some of the toughest jobs.
I'll tell you, the number is 403. You see, I remember things. This is the crazy thing. I read a book and I remember daft facts like that, but I don't actually remember the story.
Have you walked them? Have you walked them?
No. When I was a student, people used to say, "Oh, what was that person over there? That we just bumped into. Who were they?" And I wouldn't have a clue who they were. But then I suddenly remembered their address. So I'd have been good as a postie, I think. But anyway, so is there any other questions or comments or opinions that anyone wants to say? Julie, is it Dipdal or Dykdal? Do you want to say anything? Because you popped something in there. You're asking about how many were postal paths.
Hiya. Yeah, you said it correctly. It's Dybdahl. I'm actually in Norway, so it's very lovely to hear you, Alan, and I'm excited about this book.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, when you were walking these paths, if they were marked, like giving their heritage, that they were marked as postal paths or just footpaths or anything like that?
Good question. No, they're all marked as public footpaths. But what I discovered early on was that Scotland particularly had taken 5 or 6 of the old postal routes and promoted them as a tourist trail, as a postman's path. And 1 or 2 of those probably do have signposts saying the postman's path. And there were 1 or 2, only a couple in England as well, where people had, for example, the Stiperstones one I'd mentioned, the family of the last postwoman, she died, I think, in 2014. They decided to promote her route as a tourist trail in order to honour her memory and to record what she had done. And there are certainly, Scotland was very good at quickly discovering that this was a bit of history that needed keeping. And I did walk a couple in Scotland. I mentioned the Isle of Harris one. That's promoted as a tourist trail. But I hope that there will be signposts put up now that I'm starting to highlight them and other people are highlighting them. That would be a lovely idea, and make sure there's a post box at the end of it, so people can, like me, write a letter, handwritten letter, and post it at the end of it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really hope that they do mark them, and a post box. Oh, we'll all love a good post box, don't we? So thank you.
So, Julie, how does it work in Norway? Do you have a daily post person that comes to
No, sadly not anymore. They changed it to 2 or 3 days a week, and now they are trying not to give any post at all. That it's all going to be digital here in Norway and Denmark, and we are fighting it basically. So I missed a postman.
It's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, and I think, you know, we have to remember that we may be the last generation to write letters, and that's another important reason for handwriting letters. And my brothers say that they've got children, and they say that I've got more letters from them than they have, because of course they normally deal by text or email, and after 5 years or so these disappear into the ether. But I've got all these wonderful handwritten letters from them, all safely kept away. And I've got handwritten letters from my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. So they last, you know, 100 years or so. So, you know, as I say, write letters. It's this might be the swan song. This might be their requiem. So please, make sure you do, and keep your letters that you receive.
I'm sure there are plenty of mischievous people in the audience. I mean, one of the things I used to do was when I was traveling, I used to send a postcard to my dad every week, and I never put a stamp on it. I always put to pay. And he always told me that, you know, the postman would hand it to him and say, you know, you owe, I don't know, 34p or, you know, 7 and 6 or whatever it was in those days. It wasn't quite 7 and 6. I think it was 34p. And he'd look at the postcard and he'd hand it back to the postman and say, I don't want it. Because in that time, he'd read what little I'd written. And the postman didn't want to take it back. So he said, oh, have it, you know, and that was that.
Well, this is why I was telling this tale in Keswick last week, because this happened in Keswick, and Coleridge, the poet and drug addict and mountain climber, he was living in Keswick for a while, and he came across this woman at a cottage near Keswick, and she was saying to the postman, no, I don't want that letter, I can't afford it. This was in 1820, when the recipient had to pay the postage. And Sally, Coleridge felt sorry for her, so he paid. And he said, I could hardly afford the money at the time. And when the postman had gone, the woman said, well, you fool, this envelope's empty. It's from my son, and he's just put a little code, a little cross on the envelope, which says everything's okay, you know, I'm all right. So there was nothing in the envelope. And Coleridge told this story to Rowland Hill, and Rowland Hill used this as an argument for saying this is why we need to have the person sending the letter paying the postage rather than the recipient. I think in a strange way it may turn full circle. I think as the postal service dwindles, I think we might actually, in Norway and Denmark, and I think people will actually have to pay to receive a letter rather than people pay to send it. But yeah.
Oh, well, that's a very good point. Jeff, I'm going to let you ask a question because you've been putting other little jottings in the chat. So, Jeff, if Jeffrey Jones says his a little bit, whichever one you choose, Jeffrey, because you've got a few down there. And then we'll go on to the multiple choice quiz, and then we'll give Alan the last word. So Jeff, do you want to fire away with another quick question?
Yeah, well, I think we tend to forget that all the public footpaths in the UK were sort of working routes as well as walking routes. Even though I think a lot of the sort of routes were, say, to church or servants going to the big house or farm workers, that sort of thing. But I'm just thinking aloud, there probably were other services as well, like rural policemen who, you know, had to plod great distances, and maybe a lot of others as well. And then, yeah, as I say, this particular subject gets me thinking about pre-war Ealing comedies. And then the final, I've said any tragedies, murders, romances, because the postman would presumably, you know, in the social role they had, almost like the sort of parish priest.
Yeah.
Would have got involved with the people and perhaps bumped into future spouses, etc.
Yeah.
There you go.
On your first point, there's certainly footpaths always had a purpose, and Leslie and I have looked at, for example, priests and vicars walking, and there's a fair number, certainly around Cumbria, of priests' walks and vicars' alleys, and Parsons Passage is one in Eskdale, which is where the vicar was going out to sort of educate and serve the flock. And the miners' trods, coal miners, and they play a part, certainly with the postmen as well, who were going off. I did Blenheim Festiniog, and the postman going up to the offices of the slate mines. So that was an unusual one. And my next project may be on beggars' trods. And beggars' trods were those walked by tramps and beggars on a regular basis to collect money or find odd jobs. So yes, footpaths. Leslie and I will often stand on a footpath and just think, why is this even here? Why is this footpath here? As to murders and crime, yes, and I tried not to get too distracted while researching into all of these. And what I expected to find were ghosts as well of postmen, because some must have died on the footpaths. And rather spookily and bizarrely, the only ghost I came across of a postman in the end turned out to be about 50 yards from my house here in Whitehaven. And it's the ghost of a woman who walks around Whitehaven Harbour, and she's carrying a letter. And she gives you this letter as she walks round. And the point is, of course, is that you mustn't take the letter off her, because if you do, that's your fate sealed. So my UK-wide search for a ghost ended 50 yards from my front door. But yes, lots of crime, and a lot of, I think I've met more than one rural postman who met his future wife on the postal round. So certainly romance as well. If they were delivering letters, it was a chance to chat up the lady or gentleman they were due to marry.
So, Alan, a big thank you to you. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. Everyone else is on this call is definitely going to enjoy it. What's your last word?
Well, just thank you to you, Andrew, first of all, for the amount of work you've put into hosting this and organising this. And thank you to everybody for joining in. I mean, as I said at the start, it's a niche topic, but it was lovely to find other people who get it. And also just, I mean, a number of you have come through Twitter and Blue Sky and all of that. For all the horrible things going on in the world and all the nastiness that can take place, it's so lovely to have a subject and a conversation with people about something as wonderful as walking some of the most beautiful footpaths in the country and writing letters to people and just being nice to people. So keep it up. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much, Alan. And cheerio, everybody. Thanks for coming.